Good afternoon, everyone. A new week, another week of textual criticism. I promise we're drawing to a close on the Hebrew Bible. I want to go through the translations, maybe another thing or two, and then talk about how to actually apply all of these principles that we've been learning about in the practice of textual criticism. Then we'll move on to the New Testament and then to something else. You guys do seem to be enjoying it, though, so I don't feel too bad. Anyhow, today we're going to be looking at the ancient translations and introduction. Now, I said on Friday that I would talk about the usefulness of the Qumran manuscripts, and I got to thinking about it. A whole daily date on the usefulness of ancient Hebrew texts in the light of a textual criticism series doesn't seem terribly useful. It's a little redundant. So I think all of us probably understand the usefulness of Hebrew manuscripts that appear 1,000 years earlier than the sources that we had before 1947. So moving on to translations. So what are ancient translations? We're going to talk a little bit about that, what it actually means. Not the specific ones, but what it means. Then I've labeled point 2 KJV or NIV-ish. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but how did they translate? And that's sort of what I'm getting at there. It'll become clear when I get to that point. Anyway, then point 3, the various translations. What are they? Then what we're going to do is this week we're going to look at the actual translations a day at a time so that we can kind of get an idea. The Septuagint might take more than one daily data, I'm not sure. But anyhow, that's what we're going to do. Take them one at a time so that we can understand the individual sources. So, what are ancient translations? Well, a translation, of course, is taking the linguistic content of a source language, of one language, and bringing it into another language. So translation is a fun but can be very difficult process, and one has to make decisions when one translates to figure out what they're going to bring over and how they're going to bring it over. So when we're talking about the ancient translations, we're talking about the translation of the Hebrew Bible into other more common languages, more common to the period. Each of these translations would have been based ostensibly on a Hebrew text, and we call that a Vorlage. So that's the basis, the Hebrew basis. So the Septuagint, for example, in Jeremiah, had a different Vorlage than the MT, and we know that based on certain translational characteristics. Maybe we'll talk about those in a later video. But that's the text. When we say a different Vorlage, we're talking about that Hebrew text that the translator originally translated from. Now, KJV-ish or NIV-ish. So I just wanted to look at a couple of passages to make my point clear. Here in Job 26:10, and I apologize somewhat with my tongue in my cheek. Up front, to those listening that are KJV onlyists, I'd love to have you on the show to hear why you are a KJV onlyist. So email me, digitalhammurabi@gmail.com, or message us on Twitter. And if you want to come on and talk to me about why you hold to a KJV only position, particularly given all this textual criticism stuff we're talking about, love to have you on and talk to you a little bit about it. Anyway, but the King James Version has, "He hath compassed the waters with bounds until the day and night come to an end." Super clear. Whereas the NIV says, "He marks out the horizon on the face of the waters for a boundary between light and darkness." Now, the two translators here are taking the Hebrew text and they're translating it differently. Of course, the KJV has very old English, which is not nearly as clear to the modern reader. But the NIV tends to have a more, what's a good word? Dynamic is the way we would say it, but a more, what is the text actually trying to relay? So there's more of a paraphrastic isn't quite right, but type of translation. where they're trying to get at what the text is saying, not giving a literal or a word for word necessarily translation of the text from the Hebrew. And this is seen, I think, somewhat clearly here in Job 26:10. Another passage where we see this sort of comparison would be, see, look, Metathesis is there, KVJ. You see, all of us, all you great text critics out there saw that and immediately said, well, we know what the scribe did. You see, Metathesis. Anyway, so KJV. So if we were, just to harp on that a little bit longer, if we were to 1,000 years from now look at this, we wouldn't say, given the context here, if we go back to the previous slide, KJV there, NIV underneath, then KVJ here in NIV, we would not postulate that there was another version that I was using called the Keeping Validity Jovial translation, right? We would say, oh, that's metathesis, and we get that based on context. Anyway, that probably wasn't funny in any way. Moving on. Will a man leave the snow of Lebanon, which cometh from the rock of the field? That makes sense. Or the cold flowing waters that come from another place be forsaken? Now, if you don't know what that means, I don't know what to do, because that's super clear. The NIV says, does the snow of Lebanon ever vanish from its rocky slopes? Do its cool waters from distant sources ever stop flowing? Now, there's more complexity here than just how you bring this over into the Hebrew. There's some contextual issues, but the point is that, or some textual issues, but the point is that the KJV is bringing this over in a more wooden, perhaps, way. They're trying to make sense of it, but the NIV is paraphrasing far more, or it's being more liberal in its translation. And the reason is that they're trying to bring across what the text actually means, if that makes sense. So we have these issues when we look at modern day translations and when we, of course, look at these ancient translations. So when you look at the Septuagint, for example, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, you have to consider the exegesis, what came from the text linguistically when they translated from the Hebrew to the Greek or to the Latin or to the Syriac or whatever. First of all, you have to consider that the translator had to look at these consonants, this consonantal text, and figure out what words do these consonants represent. Now, that seems sort of silly unless you've been watching these videos. If you remember that slide that talks about Dalet Beit Resh, if it says diber, it means one thing. If it says davar, it means another thing. If it's davar with comments in patach, then it means another thing on down the line. So the vowel pointing can change, right? And it can change the meaning. So the translator has to say, first of all, what words or what word does this consonant or do these consonants represent? Once they figure out what the individual words are, they can then ask the question, well, what do these words how do these words go together? What's their syntactical relationship? Which words go in which phrase? Sometimes that's not always clear. Then, once they figure out what it says in Hebrew, they have to say, okay, I know what it says in Hebrew. What word most closely identifies that in Greek? If they're doing the Septuagint translation. Let's take a different example. The word agape in Greek, we would translate as love, right? But there are several different words in Greek for love. And so how do we just say love for all three of them? Do we try to nuance it to give a clearer meaning? Do we, as the next point would say, explain the text with the word agape? For example, if someone wants to translate agape as some type of unconditional love or a stronger love than one of the other Greek words, then maybe they would put a gloss or they would use more than one word, like unconditional love, right? That's an additional word that it's trying to bring across the meaning, not necessarily giving a wooden translation. So which word should I use to translate this word? And of course, there are synonyms in language, and so you can bring different words across that can be misunderstood later because different words have a different range of meaning. And if someone reading a translation later assumes a different range of meaning or a different part of the range of meaning for a word, that can cause confusion. So this is just one of the basic principles of communication linguistically. It's difficult to bring that which is signified into another language. So finally, should I explain the text? That's another question the translator has to ask and did ask. So for example, in Isaiah 6:3, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy. We know linguistically here, syntactically, that the repetition of an adjective like that, holy, 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 is an intensifier. And generally speaking, you don't see words repeated 3 times. You will sometimes see them repeated twice. 3 times it's more significant, right? So it's trying to say extraordinarily holy, right? But do you say extraordinarily holy is the Lord of hosts and try to explain it? Or do you say holy, 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 and then explain it from the pulpit, right, or from the commentary? These are decisions that translators had to make, and we still make them today. Do we go with a wooden translation and explain it somewhere else, or do we try to explain what the passage is saying or what the words are saying in the translation itself? These are difficulties, and they can lead to confusion or clarity. So, what are the various translations that we see in antiquity based on the Hebrew text? Well, first, the Septuagint, the Greek text, and its revisions, which we'll talk about beginning tomorrow. The Targumim, or the Targums, these are Aramaic. They follow the MT pretty closely, generally speaking. They can be a little more interpretive, but these are the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew text. Then the Syriac Peshitta, distinguished from the other Peshitta, which we'll talk about when we get there. This is in Syriac. And then finally, the Latin Vulgate. There is an Arabic translation, but I'm just going to stick to these 4 because I think they're probably used more frequently and more commonly. So, okay, tomorrow we're going to get into the Septuagint, the Greek translation, and try to explain what the Old Greek is as opposed to the recensions so that we can have a better understanding of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So stay tuned.